Whisky. No visit to Scotland would be complete without sampling a wee dram. Sure, you can taste Scotch all over the world, but there's nothing quite like tasting a warming single malt right here in the place it was made. Fresh spring water, malted barley and yeast. These are the three basic ingredients of a good single malt whisky. Fermented and distilled, these simple ingredients are then filled into oak casks and left to mature. At least 3 years later, but often longer, after the angels have had their share, the casks are prized open and malt whisky is born. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But the story of whisky is far more than the sum of its parts. It's a story of passion, perseverance and spirit, with a bit of mystery, magic and intrigue thrown in for good measure. The word whisky is derived from the Gaelic meaning water of life. Over time, the word uisce became usky and eventually whisky. And just as the name has evolved, the art of distilling has developed over centuries. But where did it all begin? The oldest reference to distilling in Scotland dates back to late medieval times, to Lindores Abbey in Fife. The Scottish Exchequer rolls for 1494 had an entry of 8 balls of malt to Friar John Corr, wherewith to make aqua vitae for King James IV. 8 balls of malt in modern terms would have been enough to make hundreds of bottles of today's whisky. Distilling returned to Lindores Abbey 523 years later with the opening of Lindores Abbey Distillery in 2017. By the early 16th century, we can see King James is after the good stuff again. In Inverness during September 1506, his treasurer's accounts had entries for a delivery of aqua vitae to the king. Before long, everybody was distilling whisky, for themselves and for others. And as its popularity grew, so did the profits to be made. No one had a keener eye on this than the taxman. By the early 18th century, the newly formed UK Parliament wanted to curb excessive drinking and at the same time reap the rewards of whisky sales. In 1713, the Parliament decided to impose a hefty tax on whisky production, and the great age of smuggling and illicit whisky began. To avoid paying tax, distillers started producing whisky in secret, and the Highlands, with its lovely remote glens and gorges, was the perfect place for illicit distilling. The task of shutting down illegal whisky producers fell to the deeply unpopular excisemen. Canny Highlanders defied the excisemen by smuggling their illicit whisky into the lowlands and England. Thousands of gallons were transported in pigs' bladders and tin vessels hidden in the dresses of smugglers' wives. In other parts of the country, illegal whisky production was found in the most unlikely of places, from landlocked caves on the west coast to churches on Edinburgh's High Street. Illicit whisky was even transported in coffins to avoid the taxman. Illegal distilling became so common in Scotland that by the early 19th century, more than half of the whisky consumed was supplied by smugglers. In 1823, the Excise Act cut the duty on whisky and made the legal export market to England much more attractive. As a result, the number of licensed distilleries in Scotland doubled over 2 years, and illicit distilling began to fade away. As the 19th century gathered pace and the Industrial Revolution took hold, new inventions meant that whisky was cheaper to produce in large quantities, and canny entrepreneurs began selling Scotch to the world. A cheeky beetle helped the story along too. In 1880, the phylloxera beetle devastated French vineyards, leading to a shortage of wine and brandy. The Scots were quick to take advantage, and Scotch whisky replaced brandy as the spirit of choice in middle-class drawing rooms. Whisky titans like James Buchanan, Tommy Dewar, Johnny Walker and James Chivas created export markets from Asia to the Americas. And by the early 20th century, whisky was being enjoyed all over the globe. Today, around 85% of Scotch is exported. You can enjoy whisky all across Scotland in many amazing settings. Scotland has 5 whisky regions: Speyside, the Highlands and Islands, the Lowlands, Islay and Campbelltown. Each region has its own distinctive style, evoking the landscape and conditions where the whiskies are created. Speyside, famous the world over for its many distilleries, is home to fertile rivers and glens. Malts from this region range from light and grassy to rich and sweet. Islay malts, on the other hand, crafted on the windswept shores of the west coast, are big, bold and peaty with notes of the sea. Tasting whiskies from the different regions matured in different casks is all part of the fun of discovering Scotch whisky. One of the best ways to learn more about whisky is to visit a distillery. You can take part in a fascinating tour, giving insight into the skill, expertise and craft imbued in each precious drop. If you're new to whisky, it's important to know that there are a few myths floating around. One of the most common misconceptions is that whisky is a drink for men. It's not certain where this myth originated. Dusty men's clubs, cowboy movies, take your pick. Wherever it originated, it is ridiculous. Whisky is a drink for everyone, and with the sheer variety of whiskies on offer, everybody can find their perfect dram. Another myth is that whisky must be drunk neat to be fully appreciated. This myth is slightly more controversial, with people falling on either side of the divide. But we're here to tell you that you can enjoy your whisky whichever way you like. Some people like a splash of water, some people like ice, some people enjoy a whisky cocktail. It's entirely up to you, and don't let anybody tell you any different. People have been making whisky in the same way for hundreds of years, but never on such a grand scale. Today, some 20 million casks lie maturing in warehouses across Scotland, their contents waiting to be sent around the world. And whisky is famous wherever you travel. As the whisky industry continues to grow in the 21st century, whisky is not only part of the history of Scotland, it is part of the national psyche. It's more than a product. It's a link to our culture. Sláinte. If you would like to learn more about whisky, head to visitscotland.com/whisky.